Close your eyes for a second and imagine a city so vast its gold-plated towers pierced the clouds, a place where the library held every secret of the universe, and the emperor's word could move mountains. Now imagine that tomorrow, every single trace of that place is gone. Not just the buildings, but the names of the kings, the language of the people, and even the memory that they ever existed. History is usually written by the winners, but sometimes, the winners don't just want to win. They want to delete the loser from reality itself. We call these the Forbidden Empires. These are the civilizations that were so powerful, so terrifying, or so advanced that the rest of the world conspired to scrub them from the map. They were buried under deserts, drowned in oceans, or systematically burnt out of every scroll and stone tablet. Today we are going on a journey to find the ghosts of the past. We are digging up the empires that were never supposed to be found, exploring the forbidden corners of our world, and figuring out exactly why someone wanted them forgotten. Our first stop takes us to the high, jagged peaks of the Taurus Mountains in what is now Turkey. For thousands of years, historians believed the great powers of the ancient Near East were just Egypt and Mesopotamia. Then, in the late 19th century, strange hieroglyphs began appearing on stones that didn't look like anything Egyptian. Archaeologists stumbled upon the Hittite Empire. At its peak, this was a superpower that stood shoulder to shoulder with the mighty Ramses the Great. They were the masters of iron, keeping the secret of smelting metal so guarded that it gave them an almost supernatural advantage on the battlefield. Their chariots were the tanks of the ancient world, faster and heavier than anything else. But around 1200 years before the Common Era, the Hittites didn't just fall. They vanished. Their capital city, Hattusa, was burned to the ground with such intensity that the stone walls actually vitrified, turning into glass. For nearly 3,000 years, the world forgot they ever lived. Why? Because the mysterious sea peoples and internal rebellions didn't just end their reign, they incinerated their identity. The subsequent empires didn't want the secret of iron to get out, and they didn't want anyone remembering a power that had once humbled Egypt. They were erased so thoroughly that until a century ago, they were considered a myth. Now, let's head east, deep into the dense, humid jungles of the Indus Valley. We've all heard of the pyramids and the Great Wall, but have you heard of Melusia? That was the name given by the Mesopotamians to a massive, sprawling civilization that lived in what is now Pakistan and western India. These people built cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. These were not just settlements, they were urban masterpieces. They had indoor plumbing, grid-based streets, and standardized weights and measures at a time when most of Europe was still living in huts. They were a peaceful, mercantile empire that traded pearls and ivory across the Arabian Sea. But here is the mystery. We cannot read their writing. Their script remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of human history. And because we can't read their words, their story was stolen from them. Around 1900 years before the Common Era, the rivers shifted, the climate changed, and the people walked away. The jungles swallowed the brick towers, and the memory of Melusia faded into legend. They weren't erased by a sword, but by the silence of their own language. When a civilization loses its voice, it becomes forbidden to the future. Further south in the heart of Africa, we find the kingdom of Aksum. At one point, the Persian prophet Mani described Aksum as one of the 4 greatest powers in the world. Alongside Rome, Persia, and China, they were the middleman of the world, controlling the trade routes between the Roman Empire and India. They were builders of giant stone obelisks, some of the largest single pieces of stone ever moved by human hands. They were among the first to adopt a certain major religion, creating a unique culture that blended African, Arabian, and Mediterranean influences. But as the trade routes shifted and new powers rose in the north, Aksum was pushed into the highlands. Their ports were taken, their gold mines went dry, and a legendary queen named Gudi reportedly led a campaign to burn their churches and monuments to the ground. She wanted to wipe away the old order completely. For centuries, the greatness of Aksum was treated as a fairy tale told in Ethiopian highlands, a forbidden history until modern archaeology proved that these African kings once held the balance of the world in their hands. Let's cross the Atlantic to the misty mountains of the Andes. Long before the Inca ever built Machu Picchu, there was the Wari Empire. This was a civilization that figured out how to farm on the sides of vertical cliffs and built a highway system that stretched for thousands of miles. They were the master planners of the mountains. But the Wari didn't just go away, they were systematically dismantled. It seems there was a massive social collapse, perhaps caused by a century-long drought. But the erasure was intentional. The people who came after them, including the Inca, took the Wari's technology and their roads, but chose to rewrite the history books. They claimed that the mountains were a wild, unorganized chaos before the Inca arrived. By taking the Wari's blueprints and deleting their names, the new rulers made the Wari a forbidden memory. It stayed that way for 500 years until we realized that the foundations of the Inca Empire were actually built on the ghosts of the Wari. But perhaps the most chilling example of an erased empire comes from Central Asia. Have you ever heard of the Khwarezmian Empire? In the early 13th century, this was a jewel of the Islamic world. Their cities like Samarkand and Merv were centers of science, mathematics, and stunning blue-tiled architecture. They thought they were untouchable. Then, they made a mistake. They offended a rising leader from the steppes named Genghis Khan. They didn't just refuse to trade with him, they harmed his envoys. The response was not just a conflict, it was an extinction event. The Mongols didn't just take the cities. They diverted rivers to flow over the ruins so that life could never return there. They were told to leave nothing standing, not even the cats and dogs. The Khwarezmian Empire was so thoroughly scrubbed from the earth that for a long time, we only had the accounts of the victors to tell us they ever existed. It was a forbidden empire because the Mongols wanted to use their fate as a warning. To cross the Khan was to be deleted from the Book of Time. Now, let's look at a civilization that was erased not by fire, but by the very water they lived on. In the marshes of southern Iraq, archaeologists have been finding traces of the first dynasty of the Sealand. For centuries, these people were mentioned in old Babylonian scrolls as a mysterious group of rebels and kings who ruled the southern swamplands. They were the masters of the reeds and the tides. They fought against the famous kings of Babylon, and often won. But because they lived in a landscape made of mud and water, their palaces didn't survive like the stone temples of the north. They were a forbidden shadow in the history of Mesopotamia, a group of people who defied the greatest kings on earth and then vanished back into the mist. It is only recently, with satellite imagery and new excavations, that we are realizing the Sealand kings weren't just a minor nuisance. They were a legitimate empire that held power for hundreds of years. They were erased by the environment, leaving only a few clay tablets to whisper their names. In the Pacific, there is the mystery of Nan Madol. Built on the island of Pohnpei, this is a city constructed entirely on artificial islands made of massive basalt columns. Some of these stones weigh 50 tons. How a culture with no metal tools and no pulleys moved these stones across the lagoon remains a mystery. This was the seat of the Saudeleur dynasty. Legend says they were a cruel, oppressive group of rulers who demanded impossible tributes from their people. Eventually, they were overthrown by a hero from another island. But the victor didn't move into the city. He declared it a forbidden place, a site of bad energy and spirits. The city was abandoned to the mangroves. The history of the Saudeleurs was preserved only in oral chants, hidden from outsiders for centuries. This was an empire erased by fear and superstition, a stone ghost sitting in the middle of the ocean, waiting for its story to be told. Why do we do this? Why does humanity have this urge to burn the past? It's about control. If you can control the past, you can control the present. In ancient Egypt, there was a king named Akhenaten. He was a revolutionary who decided that instead of many gods, there was only one, the sun disk, the Aten. He built a brand new city in the desert called Amarna and moved the entire government there. He changed the art, the religion, and the very soul of Egypt. But after his time ended, the people who followed were so angry and so terrified of what he had done that they launched a campaign of damnatio memoriae. They chipped his face off every statue. They tore down his city stone by stone. They removed his name from the list of kings. For thousands of years, Akhenaten was a forbidden pharaoh, a hole in the timeline of Egypt. It was only because his city was in the middle of nowhere and got covered by sand that we eventually found the evidence of his existence. They tried to delete a king, but the desert kept his secret. In Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire is famous for Angkor Wat, but there were other cities, other capitals like Mahendraparvata, hidden deep in the mountain jungles of Cambodia. These were massive, sprawling urban centers connected by sophisticated water management systems. But as the empire faced environmental collapse and shifting power dynamics, these cities were simply swallowed. The trees grew through the streets, and the people moved on to the coast. For a long time, these mountain empires were forbidden territory, lost to the Khmer Rouge conflicts and the dense vegetation. Now, using laser technology from the air, we are seeing the outlines of entire cities that nobody knew were there. It turns out the Khmer Empire was much larger and much more complex than the history books ever suggested. They were erased by time and the jungle, hidden until we developed the eyes to see through the leaves. The story of the Garamantes in the Sahara Desert is another amazing example of a forbidden empire. For a long time, the Romans described the people living deep in the desert as primitive nomads. But we've discovered that the Garamantes were actually a sophisticated urban civilization. They developed an incredible system of underground tunnels called fougera to tap into fossil water deep beneath the sand. They had hill forts, blooming gardens in the middle of the wasteland, and a trade network that crossed the entire desert. Why did they vanish? The water ran out, but they were also erased by the bias of historians who couldn't believe an empire could exist in such a harsh place. They were forbidden because they didn't fit the narrative of what a civilization should look like. Let's talk about the Maya. We know a lot about them now, but for a long time, the great collapse of the 9th century made them a forbidden mystery. Massive cities with hundreds of thousands of people were simply abandoned. Why? It wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm of climate change, overpopulation, and constant conflict. But what's really interesting is how the forest took them back. The Maya didn't disappear. Their descendants still live in the region today, but the empire was erased. The knowledge of how to read their glyphs was lost for centuries, partly because during the colonial era, thousands of Maya books were intentionally burned. A priest named Diego de Landa once wrote a book about Maya culture while simultaneously burning their libraries, because he believed they were works of the devil. That is the definition of making an empire forbidden. You destroy the books, and you destroy the history. Moving back to Europe, we have the Tartessos civilization in southern Spain. The Greeks wrote about a land of incredible wealth, a place of silver and gold located beyond the Pillars of Hercules. For a long time, people thought Tartessos was just a myth, perhaps the origin of the Atlantis story. Then, archaeologists began finding strange, beautiful metalwork and the foundations of massive buildings buried under the marshes of the Guadalquivir River. It seems Tartessos was a true trading empire that connected the Atlantic with the Mediterranean, but they disappeared around the 6th century before the Common Era. Whether it was a flood, a shifting of trade routes, or an invasion by the Carthaginians, their memory was suppressed until they became nothing more than a ghost story. There is a psychological weight to being an erased empire. It's not just that the people are gone, it's that the lesson they learned is lost to us. When we find these places, we find clues about our own future. We see how empires can be undone by something as small as a change in rainfall or as large as the ego of a single ruler. The Mississippian culture in North America, with their great city of Cahokia, is a perfect example. At its height, Cahokia was larger than London was at the same time. They built massive earthen mounds that still stand today near St. Louis. But when the first European explorers arrived, the city was empty. No one knew who had built it. The history was forbidden because there were no written records, and the oral traditions had been fractured by the movements of tribes. It took modern science to show us that North America once had a sprawling, urban empire that rivals anything in the ancient world. The erasure of empires often happens at the intersection of power and belief. In India, the empire of the Kushans once spanned from Tajikistan to the Ganges. They were the ones who first started depicting a certain enlightened figure in human form, blending Greek art styles with Eastern philosophy. They were the kings of the Silk Road, but as the Gupta Empire rose, the memory of the Kushans was pushed to the sidelines. Their coins were melted down, and their statues were buried. They became a forbidden link in history, a bridge between East and West that many wanted to bridge over. Even in the relatively recent past, empires are erased. Think of the Comanche Empire in the American West. For a century, they were the dominant power of the Great Plains. They had a sophisticated military, a massive horse-based economy, and a diplomatic reach that frustrated both the Spanish and the American governments. But because they didn't build stone cities or leave behind leather-bound books, historians for a long time refused to call them an empire. They were labeled as marauders or tribes. By changing the vocabulary, the reality of their regional dominance was erased. It's only now that historians are recognizing the Comanche Empire for what it truly was. This is an erasure of definition, making a power forbidden by refusing to acknowledge its status. One of the most enigmatic erased empires is the Kingdom of Mitanni. Located in northern Mesopotamia, They were the rivals of the early Hittites and Egyptians. They were such a big deal that Egyptian pharaohs used to marry Mitanni princesses to secure peace. They were the world's best horse trainers. But when their empire fell to the Assyrians did what they did best. They wiped the slate clean. They moved populations, destroyed records, and built their own cities on top of the Mitanni ruins. For a long time, we only knew about the Mitanni because other people mentioned them. We didn't have their own voice. We are only now finding their palaces, and every new discovery reveals a culture that was vastly more influential than we ever realized. What about the White Walls of Memphis in Egypt? While we know Memphis existed, the original Old Kingdom city, the one that built the Great Pyramids, is largely gone. The Nile River shifted its course over thousands of years, burying the heart of the first great empire under meters of silt and modern villages. The very people who created the concept of a state have their original home hidden from us. It is an empire erased by the very geography that allowed it to flourish. The reason these empires are forbidden is that they challenge our current understanding of the world. If we admit that there was a massive advanced civilization in the Amazon rainforest, which LiDAR technology is now suggesting was true, we have to change our entire story about South American history. If we admit that the ancient people of the Sahara were master engineers, we have to rethink our ideas about primitive cultures. Erased empires are dangerous because they prove that greatness isn't permanent. They prove that you can be the most powerful person on Earth today, and in 1,000 years, nobody will know your name. Think about the Silla dynasty in Korea. They united the peninsula and created a golden age of art and science. They had golden crowns that are among the most intricate ever found. But through successive invasions and the rise of new dynasties, much of the Silla heritage was systematically replaced. Only in the Tumuli Park of Gyeongju, where the giant burial mounds look like natural hills, did their secrets survive. They were hidden in plain sight, forbidden by the passage of time and the changing of cultural guards. The Champa pearls of Vietnam are another example. The Cham people had a magnificent seafaring empire that lasted for over 1,000 years. They were the masters of the South China Sea. But as the Vietnamese moved south, the Champa culture was slowly absorbed and dismantled. Their stunning brick towers still stand along the coast, but for a long time, their history was treated as a footnote. They were an empire erased by the slow, steady pressure of a neighbor. There's a common thread here. Humans are very good at forgetting what we don't want to see. We want to believe that our current way of life is the pinnacle of human achievement. But the ruins of Nan Madol, the vitrified walls of Hattusa, and the buried tunnels of the Garamantes tell a different story. They tell us that we are just one in a long line of experiments. These forbidden empires were the high-water marks of their time. They had languages that expressed complex emotions, scientists who understood the stars, and artists who captured the beauty of the world. And yet, they are gone. The most powerful eraser in history isn't fire or water. It's neglect. When we stop telling the stories, the empire truly vanishes. That's why the work of modern archaeology and history is so important. By uncovering these forbidden empires, we are bringing them back into the fold of the human family. We are giving voice to the silent kings of the Sealand and the lost builders of the Andes. We are saying that their lives mattered and that their achievements are part of our collective heritage. In the end, every empire that was erased from history was erased for a reason. Sometimes it was a jealous successor who wanted to be the only one remembered. Sometimes it was a natural disaster that proved too much for the systems of the day. And sometimes it was just the slow, quiet march of the desert or the jungle. But as long as we keep looking, as long as we keep asking who built this and why is this here, no empire is ever truly forgotten. They are just waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows. As we look at the world today, we have to wonder, what will be the forbidden empire of the future? What parts of our world will be scrubbed from the records in 1,000 years? It's a humbling thought, but it also gives us a sense of connection to all those who came before us. We are all part of this incredible, complicated, and often hidden story of humanity. The forbidden empires aren't just ruins. They are mirrors. They show us our ambition, our fragility, and our enduring desire to leave a mark on the world, even if that mark is eventually covered by the tide. So, the next time you hear about a new discovery in a place where nobody thought anything existed, remember the Hittites, remember Aksum, and remember the Sealand. Remember that the map of the past is much fuller than we think. There are still ghosts in the jungle and secrets under the sand. The forbidden empires are still out there, and they are ready to tell us their secrets, if only we have the courage to look. History is a vast ocean, and we are only seeing the ripples on the surface. Beneath the waves, there are entire worlds waiting to be rediscovered. These are the empires that were supposedly erased. But as we've seen, nothing is ever completely gone. The truth has a way of rising to the surface, breaking through the silence and the fire to remind us of who we once were. And in that remembering, we find a much richer, much more diverse, and much more exciting version of our human story. Thanks for coming on this journey into the forbidden. Keep your eyes on the horizon, because the next erased empire might be right under your feet.